The oversight hearing with the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will now begin. The subject matter for this morning's oversight hearing is on the Bureau of Land Management's efforts with regards to disappearing helium program, and we'll get into that in a moment. But before I do, let me indicate that this is the subcommittee's first hearing since the tragic accident that took place in the Gulf of Mexico with the loss of lives. Certainly I, and I believe members of the subcommittee, want to extend our sympathy and concerns for the families who lost their loved ones in that tragic accident, and obviously the impacts of that accident with regards to the environmental spill is something that we are all focused on. The Department of Interior, I believe, has sent over 13,000 personnel together with the Coast Guard, Homeland Security, and others that are now out on the Gulf in Louisiana and Alabama and the other states, trying to assure that we do everything that is humanly possible to stop the spill and work in conjunction with the private sector, with British Petroleum and the other parties to the impacts of this pending horrific spill that is taking place. It is Chairman Ray Hall and I have spoken a number of times with regards to this entire incident. The full committee will be holding hearings later this month with Secretary Salazar reporting to the full committee, and we will have an opportunity, hopefully by that time, that the leak will have been, if not completely stopped, significantly reduced, and the efforts to do the remedial applications so that we can minimize the impact to the environment will be taking place. In June, it is the intention of the subcommittee chair to hold at least one hearing, if not a series of hearings, to look at the proposal that the Department of Interior is considering with regards to dividing the responsibility of mineral and management services as it relates to both the royalty program and the inspection of these facilities throughout the Gulf and other places offshore in American waters. We will do our due diligence. It's also the desire of this chairman and working with the full committee chairman to provide an opportunity for members of the full committee and subcommittee and to go actually down and visit and see firsthand what's taken place. It is this chairman's view that going down there now would not be helpful to the process. We want them to fix it and to do all the corrective action. We can do our due diligence and the appropriate oversight once they have hopefully stopped the leak and they begin to deal with the remedial efforts that clearly must be done. But at this point, with all the efforts that are taking place, I think I would not want our visit to be counterproductive or get in the way of what needs to be happening right now. But we certainly want to provide that opportunity for members at the appropriate time, and I hope that will be within the next month. So I wanted to put that in perspective because obviously it is central to the focus and the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. And while we're holding this hearing this morning, this had been scheduled over a month ago, and I don't want anyone to think that simply because we're holding this hearing today that we're not focused on what is, I think, a very, very critical issue for our country, for this subcommittee, and for the full committee. And I know Chairman Rahal takes the responsibility and the jurisdiction of his full committee very, very, very seriously, and he will be obviously doing everything we can, working with all the members of the subcommittee. He's going to be sending out a letter to the members of the subcommittee that basically outlines a course of action for the full committee and what he would like us to focus on with the subcommittee here soon. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, because this catastrophe that has happened is obviously on the news every day, and it's on the minds of many Americans who are concerned about the focus of our energy policy in this country. And it is the appropriate jurisdiction, both at this subcommittee and the full committee, and we intend to fully discharge our responsibilities in those areas. So with that understood, I'll begin my opening statement with regards to today's subject matter at hand. The Federal Helium Program is something that has existed for decades, and I think oftentimes people have an interesting sense of what the Federal Helium Program may or may not be. Notwithstanding the challenges, many challenges that we face with energy, I think it's important to note that while we may think of helium as something that we put in balloons or that used to have an impact on dirigibles decades ago, the helium that we're familiar with, a box on the periodic table when I was a student, I guess when many of us were students, is more than just that party balloon that we may associate with it. Helium is a very important natural gas. It's the most, it is contained in most natural gas fields in the United States, but not always in commercial quantities, as our expert witnesses will tell us. Only some natural gas fields have high enough concentrations of helium to make its extraction economically and attractive to the private sector. Most of those fields, about 2/3 of our domestic supply of helium, reside in certain localities in our country, North Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The rest is located in Wyoming and the ranking member state of Colorado, as well as Utah. Those who are not aware may be interested that the United States government stores significantly what is taxpayer-owned as well as privately owned helium in a unique natural dome that is located just outside of Amarillo, Texas, maintained by the American taxpayer, which is in part why we're having this hearing today. So here's the thing. Helium isn't just the gas used for party balloons or for deep sea diving. Helium is, in fact, essential to common medical diagnostic tool under which many of us are familiar with and have benefited from our families or friends, namely known as MRIs, our magnetic resonance imaging. These MRIs, of course, are a common tool that we use in medical diagnostic practices for a host of diseases that we deal with and injuries. Helium is also essential for numerous other applications, from optical fibers to space rockets to the next generation of nuclear reactors. It's an important natural element. It's an important natural gas, and therefore we think it's important that we have this hearing today. Our space agency, NASA, needs helium, up to 107 million cubic feet a year, to pressurize and purge the engines of the space shuttles. The Department of Energy relies on helium in its research laboratories to operate superconductors. In many scientific and medical uses, there is absolutely no substitute for helium because of its unique properties. It has a low boiling point, high thermal conductivity, and inertness. These are all things that if I had paid more attention to as a student when I was learning about the table, I would know better today. But they are important factors nonetheless, and that's why we're holding this hearing. We're fortunate that the United States has major helium resources, at least 20% of the identified resources worldwide. We are the #1 producer of helium. Our domestic helium assets include the federal stockpile of helium, also known as the Federal Helium Reserve, which contains approximately 24 billion cubic feet of helium, enough helium to meet our domestic needs for years if we manage it wisely. But there are some warnings, and that's why we want to have the panel of experts testify this morning. Future shortages of affordable helium would be an obstacle for U.S. for advances in medicine, science, and aerospace, as well as other critical applications, which brings us again to what we will hope to learn today. In 1996, Congress made a sense to privatize and sell the helium resources. That circumstance has changed. The National Academy of Sciences reported so clearly illustrates. In that National Academy of Science report, it said that we should and will consider whether a new direction is needed for the Federal Helium Program. The questions that I will be looking at answers for today are whether or not we should continue to sell off the Federal Helium Reserve. Is that appropriate? If a stockpile should be maintained, is that appropriate? And if, in fact, we should maintain a stockpile, what is the prudent size of that stockpile? Whether the prices and fees for federal helium and storage of private helium are appropriate. The price structure, some indicate, is impacted because, in fact, we have this reserve. Would it change greatly if we no longer had this reserve? Should the government policies adequately encourage conservation of helium? Again, we have a distinguished panel of experts, including the co-chairs of the National Academies. Most recent report of the Helium Program, former director of the U.S. Geological Survey, Dr. Charles Grote, Dr. Robert Richardson, winner of a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1996. Congratulations, Doctor. I know all Americans are proud of that achievement, and as certainly I am. So we look forward to the testimony, and I'll defer to my colleague, the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Doug Glanborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing today and for the witnesses for being here. But before we start, I too recognize that this is the first hearing of the Energy and Minerals Subcommittee since the tragic explosion of the Deepwater Horizon rig in the Gulf of Mexico. I would like to express my sympathy as well and offer my condolences to the workers whose lives have been cut short and their families whose lives will never be the same. I also hope that the environmental and economic damages can be kept to a minimum. The Natural Resources Committee has oversight on this offshore leasing spill and the natural resource damages caused by it, and it's critical that we continue active engagement on this matter. I know that we have hearings planned on this disaster and that the committee has been actively engaged in working to address the crisis, as well as to answer the questions about what happened and if the government has responded appropriately. This is a major concern for us as a committee and for the entire nation, and we will continue to keep the residents of the area in our thoughts. Today's hearing is on our nation's helium program and the National Academy's recent report about the effects of the 1996 Helium Privatization Act. Since the helium program's inception in 1925, it has changed substantially. The program has served a broad range of interests over nearly a century, including providing for our nation's defense, scientific research, medical needs, and aerospace technology. The National Academy's examination of the privatization of the helium industry has generated a number of important questions. Should the U.S. finish the privatization of the helium industry, or should we revisit the privatization issue in light of changing demands for helium and the nation's growing import dependence on energy and mineral resources? Should the Bureau of Land Management continue to maintain the long-term storage facility for crude helium? Should the reserve be completely depleted by its current schedule of 2015? And at what rate should the government continue to sell off its helium reserve? Also, in our current economic state, it is critical to examine the projected worldwide supply and demand of helium over a long term. And after such examination, what course of action should the government take for a long-term policy? Our helium program has proved to be a great asset to our defense and to our technological development over the past century, and we must continue with its responsible management. To close, I will have a few questions for our witnesses, and I'm looking forward to hearing their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Colorado for your kind words, and we both share in the loss of lives that took place as a result of that accident, and to the families. And so we will now proceed with our witnesses, and we have four that we will hear testimony from. I believe most of you, if not all of you, have testified before a congressional panel. You know the rules. You have a 5-minute statement to make. There are 3 lights there in front of you. The green light stays on for 4 minutes, and then the yellow light goes on your 5th minute, and then when the red light goes on, hold on to your chair. No, not really. Chairman tends to be fairly benign about those things, but we do want to keep it within the 5 minutes, please, if at all possible. And then when we finish with our 4 witnesses, we'll then give the opportunity for members of the subcommittee to ask questions. Our first witness is Ms. Marceline Burke, Deputy Director of the Bureau of Land Management. She's accompanied by, I believe, Mr. Tim Spisak. Is that right? Spisak, okay. Deputy Assistant Director for Minerals and Realty Management for the Bureau of Land Management. Let's begin with you, and we'll proceed on to our other witnesses. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the other members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify on the Bureau of Land Management's Helium Program. The BLM plays a key role in the management and stewardship of the nation's helium resource, and as you said, I'm joined here by Mr. Tim Spisak, and he managed the BLM's helium operations from 1997 to 2004. I'll briefly summarize my written testimony and ask that the written testimony in its entirety be made a part of this record. Helium is a critical non-renewable natural resource that has increasingly important role in the scientific, medical, and engineering fields. The federal government's interest in helium dates back to World War I, and its potential to lift military reconnaissance devices high above battlefields. Recognizing the importance of helium, the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 reserved to the federal government all helium produced on federal lands, a reservation that remains in effect today. There have been 3 key legislative actions regarding the helium program. In 1925, Congress created the Federal Helium Program under the Bureau of Mines, which allowed for federal production, storage, and refinement of helium from the Hugoton gas fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The Helium Act of 1960 changed the program's mandate from exclusive government production of helium to conservation of the resource. This legislation granted the Bureau of Mines the authority to borrow money from the U.S. Treasury to purchase helium from private gas producers in order to store the helium at the Bush Dome Reservoir near Amarillo, Texas. The proceeds from the sales of helium were expected to allow the Bureau of Mines to repay the debt. Demand for helium rarely, if ever, however, met the expectations underlying the terms of the Treasury's loan to the Bureau of Mines. When the 1995 deadline to pay off the debt arrived, the $252 million the Bureau had spent on privately produced helium had increased with interest to $1.3 billion. Congress then passed the Helium Privatization Act of 1996, which requires the BLM to make available for sale the vast majority of the stockpile of crude helium, with the goal of paying off the helium debt by 2015. When Congress passed the act, there was approximately 30.5 billion standard cubic feet of helium in storage in the Bush Dome Reservoir. The act mandated that the BLM offer for sale all of the helium in excess of 600 million standard cubic feet of permanent reserve. The act requires the BLM to use the amounts of the helium debt and the helium in storage as parameters for its sales of crude helium. To this end, the BLM offers for sale 2.1 billion cubic feet of crude helium each year. The act also mandated that the federal government stop refining helium, thus privatizing the refining helium market. The BLM currently operates the Federal Helium Program based in Amarillo, Texas, with the primary goal of paying off the helium debt. To this end, the BLM has paid over $750 million to the Treasury. In addition to operating a storage and pipeline system, the program operates a crude helium enrichment unit that helps draw down the helium reserve in a more uniform manner. The program also manages helium extracted from federal resources not connected to the Hugoton field, including the management of the associated fees and royalty contracts. Another major component of the helium program is the in-kind program, which supplies helium to federal agencies such as NASA and the Department of Energy for scientific research, aerospace projects, and defense purposes. Under the in-kind program, federal agencies purchase all of their refined helium from private suppliers who in turn are required to purchase an equivalent amount of crude helium from the Federal Helium Reserve. The National Academies of Science has completed 2 studies of the BLM's helium program, one in 2000 and another this year. The BLM is currently reviewing this pre-publication version of this report, and looks forward to future discussion about its recommendations. The BLM welcomes further discussion about the helium program and the BLM's role in meeting future helium needs for the country. The expansion of helium-dependent technology and declining domestic reserves means the importance of helium as a strategic resource is likely to increase. We look forward to working with this committee in order to address this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And you were within the time frame, so the Chairman appreciates that. Our next witness is Ms. Anu Mittal. Is that correct?
Yes.
The Director of Natural Resources for the Environment, for Natural Resources and Environment for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. So please begin your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to participate in your hearing on the Federal Helium Program. As you know, the federal government has played a role in the production, storage, conservation, and use of helium for over 80 years. In the early 1990s, GAO reported on various aspects of the helium program and made recommendations to Interior and the Congress regarding possible changes to the program. The passage of the Helium Privatization Act of 1996 and the construction of the Helium Enrichment Unit in 2003 have changed the program since our work in the early 1990s. My testimony will focus on these changes and the key issues that we believe that the Congress will need to address before 2015. I would like to first summarize some of the key effects of the 1996 Act. First, with regard to the helium debt, as you know, the 1996 Act effectively froze the debt at $1.37 billion. Because interest stopped accruing on the debt, Interior has been able to pay off a large portion of this amount and expects to pay off the entire debt by 2015. When the debt is paid off, the helium fund that Interior uses to operate the program will also be terminated. Second, the 1996 Act required Interior to offer for sale all but 600 million cubic feet of crude helium in storage by 2015. Interior, however, has not been able to sell all of the helium that it has offered for sale, and only about 68% of the helium offered for sale has been sold. Therefore, about 9 billion cubic feet of crude helium is expected to remain in storage in 2015. Third, the Act required Interior to set the price for crude helium using a formula that would cover program costs, pay off the debt, and account for inflation. As a result, the initial minimum selling price for federal crude helium after the Act was passed was higher even than the private price for refined helium. Over time, however, private helium prices have continued to increase and are now almost double the federal crude price. Fourth, the Act established an in-kind program to meet federal needs for helium. While total federal demand for helium has fluctuated from year to year, it represents only about 10% of the total domestic demand. However, since 2001, the total domestic demand for helium has generally decreased, and total foreign demand, on the other hand, has consistently increased. Finally, a key development which has addressed the helium purity concern that we reported in the early 1990s is the construction and operation of the Cliffside Helium Enrichment Unit. According to Interior officials, as we have just heard, the enrichment unit has allowed them to better manage the drawdown and purity of the helium in storage. As you would expect, some of these changes have led to concerns about the future availability of helium for federal and other uses. And because the 1996 Act does not provide specific direction for the helium program past 2015, we have identified 3 key issues that the Congress will need to address within the next 5 years. First, how should the helium remaining in storage after 2015 be used? In light of the changing demand for helium and the potential for future shortages, we believe that the Congress will have to decide whether the 9 billion cubic feet of crude helium expected to be in the reserve by 2015 should be sold or should be conserved. Second, how will the helium program be funded after 2015? If the helium debt is paid off in 2015 and the helium fund is terminated, it is not clear how the operations of the program will be paid for. Currently, the program does not receive any appropriated funds. Instead, the revenues generated by the program go into the helium fund, and the program has access to those funds to pay for day-to-day operations. The Congress will have to decide how the program's operations will be funded after the helium fund is terminated. Finally, at what price should Interior sell the remaining crude helium in storage? Interior's price for crude helium since 1996 has been tied to the program's operating costs and debt. Once the debt is paid off, it will no longer be a factor in setting this price, and therefore raises uncertainty about how Interior will or should set the price for remaining crude helium in storage. The price set by Interior is important because it affects the private industry price for both crude and refined helium. Mr. Chairman, as you can see, these uncertainties demonstrate that it is time once again for the Congress to step in and decide the future direction and operation of the helium program. This concludes my prepared statement. I would be happy to respond to any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. The 5 points that you referenced in your summary are areas that I want to revisit when we have that time, but we have 2 more witnesses. Dr. Robert Richardson, Professor and Vice Provost for Research, Emeritus Senior Science Advisor for the President and Provost of Cornell University. And as I noted in the opening, he was in 1996 awarded a Nobel Prize in Physics, and we're very honored that he is here. In addition, for members of the subcommittee, using helium in his work. You're correct. Obviously, there's a tie here. But for members of the subcommittee, Dr. Charles Grote, who's also a professor at Chair in Energy and Mineral Resources for the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin, and was the former director of the U.S. Geological Survey from 1998 to 2005. The 2 professors have submitted the written testimony in tandem. So while they will each be making a presentation for 5 minutes, the written testimony, for your information, is one that they have done together. It has a wonderful title, Up in the Air, the BLM's Disappearing Helium Program. No puns intended, I suspect. Dr. Robert Richardson, we're very anxious to hear your testimony. Please begin.
Have made a career low temperature research using liquid helium for 50 years. The chairman of the subcommittee gave an admirable summary of the uses of helium.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
And I will confine my remarks to substitution, conservation, and recovery of helium, because helium is far too precious for frivolous use.
Thank you.
For some applications, other gases can replace helium. The main reason helium is widely used in some applications is it is far too cheap. Other applications rely on helium's unique properties, and there are no alternative uses. In the first category, where the substitutions might exist, these include lifting, where uses requiring lifting, you can easily substitute hydrogen if it's not safety concerns. For instance, in India, hydrogen is substituted for helium for party balloons, and the quantity of hydrogen in the party balloons it's not particularly dangerous, and it makes it more exciting for the kids. Welding. The chemical inertness is the key for the welding, and argon can be substituted for helium, and it's the helium gas is slightly more expensive than argon, but not enough more expensive. Helium, Europe mostly uses argon, but the United States uses helium. And then semiconductor and optics manufacturing, and most of Asia uses our helium to manufacture fiber optics. Argon or hydrogen will be substituted. The essential product is superconducting magnets and basic research. I'll conclude it.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll look forward to having an opportunity to ask you some additional questions when we get to that part of the hearing. Our last witness, but certainly not least, as I indicated, both Professor Grote and Professor Richardson have submitted their written testimony together. Dr. Charles Grote is professor and chair in the Energy and Mineral Resources for the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin, As I noted, Dr. Grote was also the former director of the U.S. Geological Survey from 1998 to 2005. Could you please present your testimony, Dr. Grote?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to summarize the results of the National Research Council study on the impacts of selling off the National Helium Reserve. As the chairman and Dr. Richardson discussed the uses of helium, I'll make a couple of comments about the supply situation. In 2009, approximately 170 million cubic meters of helium were extracted from natural gas or withdrawn from the helium reserves, with approximately 78% of that production coming from the United States, 10% from Algeria, and most of the remainder from Russia, Poland, and Qatar. The U.S. supplies all domestic demand and approximately 80% of world demand. Part of the supply comes from the sale of helium from the Federal Reserve. The Helium Privatization Act of 1996 called for sales of 2.1 billion cubic feet, as noted earlier, per year in order to sell off the reserve by 2015. In 2009, the Amarillo Field Office of BLM sold 940 million cubic feet. The Federal Reserve contains about 18 billion cubic feet as of 2009. Given the actual rate of sales, there will be more than the mandated amount, 600 million cubic feet, as noted by other witnesses, of helium left in the reserve in 2015, which raises the question from the committee, what happens after 2015? The principal charge to our committee was to determine whether the sell-off of the nation's helium reserve as prescribed by law has had an adverse effect on the United States scientific, technical, biomedical, and national security users of helium. In response to this charge, the committee determined that selling off the helium reserve in the manner prescribed by the 1996 Act has adversely affected critical users of helium and is not in the best interest of U.S. taxpayers or the country. The sell-down of federally owned helium is coming at a time when demand for helium by critical and non-critical users has been significantly increasing, especially in foreign markets. If this path continues to be followed within the next 10 to 15 years, the United States will become a net importer of helium, whose principal foreign sources will be the Middle East and Russia. In addition, the pricing mandated by the 1996 Act has triggered significant increases in the price of crude helium. The helium withdrawal schedule mandated by the 1996 Act is not an efficient or responsible reservoir management plan. Another of the committee's concerns is that the drawdown schedule required by the 1996 Act, which dictates that the reserve of helium be sold on a straight line basis, the same amount must be sold each year until the reserve is substantially gone, is a wasteful way to draw down a reservoir. Because it is more costly and more likely to leave significant amounts of helium unrecoverable than alternative drawdown scenarios. The committee therefore recommends that a portion of the 1996 Act be revisited, that particular portion. Furthermore, the committee recommends that the Congress reconsider whether selling off substantially all the federally owned helium is still in the nation's best interest. The committee also addressed the needs of small-scale government-funded researchers, a group that has been particularly hard hit by the sharp price rises and the shortages that have characterized the helium market in recent times. These research programs should have some protection from the instabilities recently characterizing the helium market. Accordingly, the committee recommends that the researchers be allowed to participate in an existing in-kind program for government users of helium that would give them priority when there is a helium shortage and insulation from the accompanying dramatic retail price increases. Because the helium market is changing rapidly and helium is critically important to many users, the committee report includes recommendations that would facilitate long-range planning to meet the nation's helium requirements, including the collection and dissemination of needed information and the formation of a standing committee to regularly assess whether the national needs are being appropriately met. Finally, while noting that the question of how critical helium users in the United States will be assured a stable supply of helium in the future was beyond the scope of its charge, the committee points out that several important issues related to this topic remain unanswered. How will the large amount of federally owned helium that remained after the mandated sell-off in 2015 be managed after that date? Moreover, from a wider perspective, should the strategic helium reserve be maintained? These questions need to be answered in the near future as well before most federally owned helium is sold and will require action by the Congress. This concludes my spoken remarks.
Thank you very much. A number of questions that I had have been answered as it relates to the 1996 proposal proposal at that time by the sense of Congress to, in essence, eliminate the reserve by 2015. Professor Grote, you clearly, I think, have given us a sense that we need to revisit that 1996 policy by the Congress at that time. What has changed so dramatically in terms of the demand and the usage of helium that puts us on a different track? And I guess the other question, that is, it seems like logically you're indicating that if we eliminate the reserve, we will go in a short period of time from being the net provider of helium throughout the world to a net importer. And I'm wondering, is there not a third scenario in which, in fact, as a result of the elimination of the reserve, that it might increase domestic production for helium, and how that would take place absent the reserve?
Mr. Chairman,
there's two parts to that question: the demand, and then
right. I think the stimulus for the price changes in pricing were the events that started in 2003 when they actually began selling the helium reserve off and went on the market with helium. They sold 1.6 billion cubic feet, and as one of the testimonies pointed out earlier, the price for helium, for government helium at that time, was high, and private sector helium was low. It didn't take very long for private sector helium to move up above the government helium, so there was a large price increase. At the same time, there were demand increases globally and in the United States. There were some planned and unplanned maintenance issues, both at the
but if I'm a consumer of helium, either for scientific purposes or because I manufacture MRI machines, why would I buy helium from the private sector when it would be when it became significantly higher than the reserve?
Well, the government was only selling its helium to refiners, so they had to be refined first. So they couldn't buy it directly from the government anymore. So then the refiners were making a good profit. They were doing better, yes. In fact, and that combined with the straight line sell-off set a federal price that remained now very low, and the refined retail price went up very high. Couple that with world demand increasing, particularly in Asia. So we had the beginnings of a critical supply and demand situation that really affected the small researchers probably most significantly, because they have fixed budgets. They can't go back for more money to buy more helium, and so they really felt the pinch and were probably the most vocal about that. Your question about supply is an interesting one. Are there ways to increase the supply? If you look at the total resource base of helium in the United States, it's huge. But the base that's commercially exploitable is not. And so it's a legitimate question to wonder whether, if the price continues to go up, which would force some of the substitutions Dr. Richardson talked about, and some of the conservation that could take place, if that price were to go up, would that encourage others to process other helium resources for the helium? In other words, there's helium and natural gas in the Four Corners area.
Right. Did you look at that?
We did not.
You did not?
We did not. In fact, Mr. Chairman, one of the things we pointed out and were very emphatic about was that the availability of information about potential sources of helium, about demand for helium, about supply economic issues is sparse. We had a great difficulty in getting original data, and that's one of the reasons we put such an emphasis on trying to gather that information in formulating long-range plans.
Do both you and Dr. Richardson believe we ought to maintain a reserve?
I think the committee and Dr. Richardson and I both felt, the committee wasn't asked that question, but individuals on the committee, including both of us, feel that the reserve has a legitimate and important role in the future.
Dr. Richardson, how do you talked about how there's other uses. You went from party balloons to welding to other kinds of things that should not be used, helium that hydrogen and some of the other gases can be substitutes for. But how do you, isn't that ultimately a function of price? The helium is, or is it just availability?
I think the price, and I think that helium probably as a factor of 20 too cheap.
Too cheap, okay. I want to get back to that in a moment, but I do want to ask our lead witness if, in fact, it's been an issue that she has had with the department, with the secretary, or with others within the administration to revisit the current plan that has been moving forward, as you outlined, Ms. Marsulin, to basically pay off by 2015 and to continue to implement this, or is there a reconsideration taking place now within your agency and by the department in light of the changes that many of the witnesses have indicated in recent years?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the report has certainly generated quite a bit of discussion within the Bureau, and we are well aware of the supply and demand issues that have changed over time, making our helium less expensive relative to other sources. But the Helium Privatization Act is very specific in its direction to the Bureau. So our discretion.
I understand that, but is there any, I'm just trying to get a sense, is there any discussion taking place to reconsider that?
Yes.
Okay. My time's expired. I will now defer to the gentleman from New Jersey. We have I'm told, votes in about 15 minutes, so what I'll intend to do is to give every member here an opportunity to have 5 minutes for their questions, and if there's further time, we'll maybe consider some others, but when votes are called, it's the chair's intention to shortly thereafter close the hearing. Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the staff for assembling a good group of witnesses on what is a topic that is more important than generally recognized, and so thank you. As someone who actually wrote on this subject 3 decades ago about why it was important for the government, why it was in the public interest to maintain helium reservoirs, and as someone who was not in Congress when the revisions were made in the mid-'90s, but who read with alarm what Congress had done, I'm delighted that the chairman is revisiting this now. First of all, Dr. Richardson, did I understand you correctly to say that you think in your own opinion, that the price for helium is off by a factor of 20? Is that all right?
Party balloons are $3, and I think that be appropriate for them to sell at $60.
All right. Thank you.
Because I mean, it's not a major uses, but it's symptomatic of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, that raises lots of other questions, but let me. I thought that in recent years, and I suppose this would be a question for Ms. Burke, that the private commercial price for helium is more or less pegged to the federal price now. That there was not much discrepancy between. Am I misguided in this? Or maybe someone else can answer that. Okay.
Generally the Bureau price serves as a benchmark price, and a lot of contracts are tied to that. But they'll add on a refining charge, and so it's always going to be above. With some of the shortages that occurred over the last several years due to some of the supply issues, you have the market driving the price up quite a bit higher, and it doesn't always come back once it goes up.
A question maybe starting with Dr. Richardson and Dr. Grote, but for anyone who wants to chime in, recognizing that predictions are difficult, especially about the future. Can anybody explain why the predictions about historically the predictions about the use of helium have been pretty far off, and will that help us? Can we draw lessons from that to help us understand what future need might be?
Mr. Holt, I think part of the problem has been a benefit. It's been technology. There have been developments in technology, MRIs, for example, fiber optics, those sorts of things that put demands on helium that weren't anticipated in some of the earlier projections. And then the growth of the Asian economy that does a lot of this work has increased the volume of demand internationally. So I think the demand situation has probably been the least accurately projected, and one of our chief concerns was that with a standing committee, we might have a chance to keep a better handle on those kinds of changes than we've been able to do in the past.
Do we need to mandate or ask for better data about supplies? Does that require new studies or just reporting of data?
Speaking from the committee's opinion, I think we felt strongly that obtaining more data was important, and that the responsibility for doing that would need to be fixed with an agency or with an organization, so it was clear what the responsibilities are. The helium is, through the USGS Mineral Service, actually funded or supported through BLM, does do routine statistical gathering of information. So there is some information, but the specificity is difficult to obtain that is needed, and also some of the market changes are very difficult to monitor, and we would really benefit, I think, from better efforts there and clear responsibility assignments, which aren't there now.
Good. Thank you. I'm intrigued by your well, my time is up.
Go ahead.
I'm intrigued by the suggestion of the NRC panel that the helium be supplied in kind or in a subsidized basis to small researchers. Seems to me that would not be terribly expensive, but I guess the question is, from a congressional point of view, how would that be accomplished? This committee obviously would have no jurisdiction over that, I think. Do you have any advice for us on that?
I can reflect some of the committee discussions, and perhaps the others would care to speak in. Much of the research that uses helium by the small research community is federally funded, NSF, DOE. So they are technically federal users of helium, but they have no mechanism for accessing it since the money comes through a federal agency. And so it would be contingent upon the agency doing the funding to have a program for getting at the in-kind program. So I'm not so sure it's a question of it's illegal or immoral for that to happen. It's a question of mechanisms and processes that would be workable to do it. And we think access to the in-kind program would be a great insulator for the research community and solve many of its problems, but how you do it is the difficult part.
You're welcome. The gentleman from Maryland is next, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm neither a physicist nor an economist, and so I'm kind of hanging on by my fingernails here to this conversation. But Dr. Grote, could you just take me through again why you believe that if we don't sort of adjust the current trend, we're going to end up being importers of helium from other places? Just take me through that one more time.
A couple of factors. One is that there aren't new deposits being put online in the United States right now. I shouldn't say that's not absolutely true, but because there are small ones. But the major supply that we tap now is very mature, and so it's subject to decline with time. So if we don't look at any economic incentives to develop new supplies and our existing ones decline, and we end up selling off the Federal Reserve, the domestic supply base of helium is going to drop off dramatically over the next 10 to 15 years. We'll still have a demand. Now, the U.S. demand is flattened out, but the global demand when international added to ours, has gone up dramatically. And so if we're not supplying it, and if the dependency for helium for our own needs and the global needs are based on foreign sources, and those are based on LNG facilities in Algeria and Qatar and Russia, and if natural gas is a glut on the market, we may not see it's almost a perfect storm of factors that could lead to critical supply shortages for the U.S. community and a global situation where their supply needs aren't met as well. So it's a number of factors working together that could cause this supply disruption in a fairly short period of time.
So it's not that our reserves will be disappearing. It's that our management of the economics of this will be such that we won't have the kind of access to the reserves and the production capacity and so forth that will allow us to deliver that out of our own resources opposed to getting it someplace else? Is that
there's
right?
Some of both. Our
Okay.
own reserves in the U.S. are being depleted. If there
They
were
are.
economic
Okay.
incentives to develop additional ones, then we would help solve that problem. The amount of helium out there in natural gas that's being processed for LNG, which takes a much lower concentration, and if it were all processed and if it were turned into helium, then we would not have a numerical supply situation. It comes down, as you mentioned, to economics and the willingness of the private sector to invest in providing that helium.
I think I was being misled by the fact that by 2015 we're still going to have a certain amount of helium in the reserve, which makes one think that we're okay in terms of supply. But what you're saying is that eventually that's just a matter of time if we don't address this broader issue.
Yes,
Okay.
correct. The law says there'll be 600 million cubic feet left, and then the sell-off rate is telling us that it won't all be gone that was intended to be gone by 2015. So we will have a significant amount of helium left in the reserve, but no responsibility for what happens after that, as BLM has pointed out. So that's the
Right.
part that's hanging over us right now.
Thank you.
I just want to have a couple other questions. I don't know if Mr. Holt does, but they really take on the questions that my colleagues just asked. I mean, it's being depleted, in fact, because that was a public policy that was enumerated in 1996, right? That the federal government should not be in the business of holding a helium strategic reserve. I mean, we had a strategic petroleum reserve that used to be in California as a part of our Navy strategic defense planning. It was felt that the use of helium really dated back 80 years to a policy that was no longer strategic in nature. And so in 1996, good, bad, or indifferent, I mean, that's why we're re-examining. The plan was to phase this out by 2015. That's what we're doing, right? And what you're suggesting in the report is that in reflection of what's taken place between now and 1996 and what you see as going forward with, that you're saying it's in the United States' best interest in terms of our longer-term public policy that we maintain a reserve.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Dr. Richardson.
Yes.
And not only for strategic purposes and research, but also for commercial use?
Urgent commercial use, yes. The next generation of nuclear power reactors will require helium,
And that's a very important potential energy source,
yeah.
I believe. To further the line of questioning that Congressman Sarbanes was asking, I mean, I guess the alternative is if we eliminate this, again, you're going to have to help us a little bit because I suffer from the same level of expertise as my colleague from Maryland on this subject matter. helium is produced when we're producing natural gas, right? Generally speaking, from natural gas fields. And I guess the theory might have been in 1996 is that if we no longer have this helium reserve, that when and of course, especially in California, but elsewhere, natural gas I refer to sometimes as the energy du jour because of its clean burning attributes related to natural gas, and so it's an energy source when we have air quality issues in California that is sought after, and there is much more demand and increased production taking place with natural gas. Would that not indicate that as a part of that additional helium will be produced as at the same time, or am I missing something here?
I think the fact that most of the helium that we have in the United States is situated in very limited geographic areas means that much of the natural gas isn't coincident with those areas. So we can increase our natural gas production significantly without necessarily tapping natural gas that contains a lot of helium. So that's the basic problem. But in theory, in general, if we increase natural gas production, and if it includes areas like the Four Corners area, then we would be tapping natural gas that has some helium. And if the price were high enough to encourage commercial development of that, we might actually see some incremental increases in the helium resource base.
How would the helium program be funded, Ms. Mitchell, after 2015, once the program's debt is paid off?
That's a question that we think Congress is going to have to address, because once the helium fund is terminated, there is no mechanism for funding the program. Right now what happens is, as BLM sells the helium in storage, the funds are put in the helium fund, and then BLM has access to those funds to operate the program. But the fund is tied to the debt. So once the debt is paid off, the helium fund gets terminated, and then there's no mechanism to operate the program. So either Congress is going to have, if one wants to continue a helium program, Congress will either have to appropriate funds for the program or create some new mechanism by which the fund can continue, or some other appropriate vehicle is there for BLM to manage the operations of the program.
So that in part is the discussions, I guess, that's taking place within the department and what this subcommittee ought to be focused on as it relates to whether or not we want to continue the current policy or make changes. I mean, those are at the heart of the question, I guess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
At what price should the BLM sell its helium? In the past, the debt has been a factor in price, and price has been above market price. After the 2015 debt will be paid off, the current price is at or below market. And, of course, Dr. Richardson has already opined as to his thoughts about the inexpensiveness of what the current price of helium is today. Yes. No, Dr. Mittal, I think, that was in part what you...
It was one of the issues that I identified that needs to be addressed. You're absolutely right. Once the debt is paid off, it ceases to be a factor in the formula that BLM has been using to price helium. And so we have to consider what the public policy objective of the program is. If we want the program to be one of conservation or allowing the industry to take over more of the production of helium, then you might consider a higher than market price for the price of the crude in storage. If you want to make sure that the federal government is getting its true fair value for the helium in storage, then you might consider a market price. If the whole objective of the program is to eliminate the reserve completely, then you might go with a price that's below market price. So again, the hinge is back to what are the public policy goals for the helium program going forward.
Well, that's why we're re-examining this, and that's why your testimony is important. I mean, the policy, again, as I understood it, as was noted by Congressman Holt, none of us were here when it was established, but and maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but was basically to get the government out of the business of a strategic helium reserve. And what Professor Richardson and Professor Grote are telling us is you don't think that that the private sector can handle whatever needs are, whether it be for research or for medical science or for the next production of nuclear reactors, absent a government strategic reserve? I mean, I guess that's the threshold question that we need to wrestle with here. Dr. Grote and then Dr. Richardson.
I think,
I mean, if we just eliminate, under the theory that I guess established this program in 1996 is that whatever those needs are, and I think we've all substantiated that the needs are important, they're critical, and they're going to be a part of our long-term requirements for this country in the 21st century. So that, I think, is established. The question is, I guess, is there a role for the government to continue on this, or can the private sector handle this, or will we just become dependent upon foreign sources, as I think someone indicated?
I think you've hit the heart of the question, and that is, why do we have reserves in the first place? And we had many reserves, strategic minerals and so forth. Helium was one of them. And then we went through a period in the 90s when we decided, as a matter of policy, we get out of the reserve business, that private sector and supply and demand will take care of the situation. It's no longer necessary or in the best interest of the United States to maintain these kind of reserves. Helium was part of that, the privatization. Yet today the question is not so much could the private sector produce helium. I think the policy question is, and this is a personal opinion, is whether or not the government has a role in ensuring certain users are insulated because they're so critical from price and supply shocks, because it's in the best interest of the United States. Our small research community, small user research community on the committee felt very strongly that their role was critical to the well-being of the United States in doing research, and if they're denied a supply, then it's not good for the United States. So they would argue that the reserve is important and access to it for them is important. And I'm sure the MRI folks and the nuclear reactors of the future will feel that they're an important part of the United States future. So again, back to the policy question, is the government's role to provide this insulation through a reserve program worthy of reconsideration again, perhaps not only for helium, but there may be some other critical things that are in the same family.
Any other questions by my colleagues? Yes. Congressman Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for that line of questioning, because I think you get at the heart of the question before us. A couple of kind of random questions. In your paper, Dr. Grote and Dr. Richardson, and briefly in your testimony, you talk about efficiencies in the use of helium. How much is to be gained? What savings are there in efficiencies? You talk about low boil-off cryostats, but if you're filling dirigibles, maybe the amount that's lost from cryostats isn't, or the amount that might be saved might not be so important. So can you give me an idea of how important it might be? We just passed a week ago here in the House something called Home Star to encourage efficient use of energy. Maybe we need a lab star or a dirigible star or a weld star to encourage efficient use of helium. How significant is this?
The NASA and the Department of Defense use liquid helium for purging rockets, and it would be expensive, but it would be worthwhile to recapture that helium, because it's 25% of the uses, for instance.
So could it be, for example, a condition of sale that the user have some approved recapture technology?
Well, if it is expensive enough to begin with, then the user would be naturally encouraged to recover the helium.
That's an interesting point about some condition of sale. The committee did discuss how can you encourage conservation and more efficient use. And again, back to the small research user, they don't have the resources available to put in these recycling conservation things. And if there were some process by...
But they're using only a few percent of it.
They're not using very much, no. They're perhaps the most acutely affected, but they're not, percentage-wise, you're correct, they're not. But the large commercial users already do. MRI industry and people like that are more cautious about recycling. But there are large segments, as Dr. Richardson pointed out, that don't or can't, and that is one step the committee felt could be encouraged.
A question, actually, maybe for an economist or someone else, but let me ask it of you. Why not depend on Qatar? Why do you think that a domestic supply is needed? I mean, there's certainly many things that we are dependent on, not the least of which is petroleum, where we have, backed in or walked in or gladly embraced a dependence on international suppliers.
I think, Mr. Holder, initially the thoughts of Qatar, Algeria, and Russia being our suppliers made people nervous. But beyond that, you're correct. We still get a lot of critical minerals and resources from countries that aren't terribly stable or friendly, so that's not a new thing. My personal concern is not so much those countries, but its dependence on the international LNG production as the source for that helium. If the world glut in natural gas persists, then there are going to be some LNG facilities that don't make it economically, and if the ones that produce helium are among those, we could see a decrease in an intended large source of supply. So it's less strategic and more economic, at least my personal concern is.
Other comments on that? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your focus and interest. And now, when I see you on the floor, I can ask you how you wrote your thesis on helium several decades ago.
Actually, it wasn't my thesis, but I had written on the subject decades ago.
Well, we appreciate all the witnesses' testimony this morning. It was helpful, and we will look, as the administration is looking at this policy that has been in place, whether or not we need to have some mid-course corrections, as the national academies have indicated, it seems to me. And I think it is an important issue, clearly, not only strategically for the United States, but commercially as we go forward. So your testimony will be well used. The Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral hearing is now adjourned. Okay.